I still remember the exact moment I realized my own family had been playing me for a fool for 3 years. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and I was sitting in my lawyer's office, staring at bank statements that showed my $2.8 million inheritance had been completely drained. Not a single penny left. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers, and all I could think was how my sister Emma was supposed to be using this money for her cancer treatment. That's what they told me. That's what I believed. That's the lie that cost me everything I thought I knew about the people I called family. The whole nightmare started when my grandmother passed away 3 years ago. Grandma Rose had always been my rock, the one person in our family who treated me like I actually mattered. She'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, and unlike the rest of the family who saw me as an obligation, she saw me as her granddaughter. When the lawyer read her will, I was shocked to learn she'd left me her entire estate, the house in Connecticut, her investments, everything. The total came to $2.8 million, more money than I'd ever imagined having. I remember my Aunt Linda's face going completely white when the lawyer announced it, and my cousin Mark actually laughed out loud like it was some kind of joke. That's when my Uncle Robert, who'd always acted like the family patriarch, pulled me aside after the reading. His voice was gentle, almost fatherly, which should have been my first red flag since he'd never spoken to me that way before. He explained how the family was concerned about my ability to handle such a large inheritance at 28, especially since I was just a substitute teacher making $30,000 a year. He suggested we set up a family trust, something that would protect the money and make sure it was used wisely. My cousin Sarah, who worked in banking, nodded along enthusiastically, talking about tax implications and investment strategies that went completely over my head. But the real manipulation came when they brought up Emma. My cousin Emma, Robert's daughter, had been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer 6 months earlier. She was only 32, married with 2 young kids, and the medical bills were already astronomical. The family had been struggling to help with the costs, even setting up a GoFundMe that barely covered a fraction of what she needed. Robert sat me down at Emma's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, with Emma looking so weak and fragile from chemo, and explained how the inheritance could save her life. How Grandma Rose would have wanted the money to help family in crisis. How this was bigger than just me. This was about keeping Emma alive for her children. I can still see Emma's face that day, so pale and thin, her headscarf slightly crooked where her beautiful auburn hair used to be. She held my hand with fingers that felt like paper and whispered how she didn't want to ask, but the experimental treatment her doctors recommended wasn't covered by insurance. It would cost nearly $2 million, but it could give her a real chance at survival. The guilt hit me like a freight train. Here I was, sitting on this massive inheritance from a woman who'd always taught me that family comes first, while my cousin was literally fighting for her life. How could I possibly say no? How could I live with myself if Emma died because I was too selfish to help? The family made it so easy to say yes. Sarah had already researched the best private cancer treatment centers. Robert had connections with specialists in New York, and my Aunt Linda promised to handle all the paperwork and coordinate with the doctors. All I had to do was sign the documents to establish the family trust and transfer the inheritance. They assured me I'd have access to whatever I needed, that this was just a way to manage the money more effectively while ensuring Emma got the treatment she desperately needed. I trusted them completely. Why wouldn't I? These were the people who'd been part of my life since I was a child, who'd grieved with me when Grandma Rose passed, who seemed to genuinely care about doing the right thing. Looking back now, I realize that was the moment I signed away not just my financial future, but my faith in the people I thought I could count on most. The first red flag should have been how quickly Emma's condition seemed to stabilize once the money was transferred. Within just 2 months of signing over my inheritance, she was posting photos on Facebook of family barbecues and weekend trips to the lake. When I asked Robert about her treatment progress, he gave me vague updates about how the experimental therapy was working wonders, but the doctors wanted to take things slow. I wanted to visit Emma and see how she was doing, but the family kept telling me she was too weak for visitors, that the treatment made her extremely sensitive to germs and stress. It seemed reasonable at the time, especially since I knew chemotherapy could wreak havoc on someone's immune system. What really started bothering me was how differently the family began treating me after the inheritance was gone. Before Grandma Rose's death, I was barely acknowledged at family gatherings, just the quiet, awkward substitute teacher who sat in the corner. But during those few months when I had the inheritance, suddenly everyone wanted to include me in conversations, invite me to dinners, ask for my opinion on family decisions. Robert would call me regularly to update me on Emma's progress and thank me for my generosity. Sarah would text me photos of her kids and invite me to their birthday parties. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I actually belonged in this family. But once that money was locked away in the trust, the calls stopped coming. The invitations dried up. I was back to being invisible. The second major red flag came during Thanksgiving dinner, about 8 months after I'd signed over the inheritance. Emma looked healthier than I'd seen her in years. Her hair was growing back, she had color in her cheeks, and she was laughing and playing with her kids like nothing had ever been wrong. When I mentioned how amazing her recovery was and asked about her treatment schedule, the entire table went quiet. Robert cleared his throat and said the doctors had decided to pause the experimental treatment for a few weeks to let her body recover. Emma just smiled and said she was feeling blessed, but something in her eyes looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. Later that evening, I overheard my Aunt Linda on the phone with someone, saying something about the lake house renovations being ahead of schedule and how they'd gotten such a good deal on the boat. That conversation nagged at me for weeks. What lake house? What boat? I knew the family had been struggling financially before Emma's diagnosis. Robert had been laid off from his job at the manufacturing plant, and Sarah was dealing with her own divorce and legal fees. How were they suddenly able to afford renovations and recreational purchases? When I casually asked Robert about it during our next phone call, he got defensive and said Linda must have been talking about someone else's family. But his voice had that sharp edge I remembered from childhood, the tone he used when he was lying about who ate the last piece of pie or broke something in Grandma Rose's house. The breaking point came almost 2 years after I'd signed over the inheritance. I was at the grocery store in my small town when I ran into Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who'd been friends with Grandma Rose for decades. She pulled me aside and started talking about how proud Grandma Rose would have been of my generosity, but then she said something that made my blood run cold. She mentioned how she'd heard from her daughter who worked at the county clerk's office that the family had purchased not 1, but 3 properties in the past year, a lake house in New Hampshire, a condo in Florida, and some kind of investment property downtown. Mrs. Henderson thought it was wonderful that Emma's recovery had allowed the family to get back on their feet financially. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Emma's miraculous recovery, the family's sudden wealth, and how I'd been systematically excluded from their lives once my usefulness expired. I started doing research online, looking up property records and trying to piece together what was really happening with my inheritance. What I found made me physically sick. The trust that was supposed to be protecting my money and funding Emma's treatment had been used to purchase multiple properties, all in Robert's name. There were also records of expensive vacations, luxury car purchases, and what appeared to be a significant investment in Robert's new construction business. Meanwhile, I was still living in my tiny apartment, still substitute teaching, still driving the same beat-up Honda I'd had since college. The final piece of the puzzle came when I hired a private investigator to look into Emma's medical records. What he discovered destroyed any remaining faith I had in my family. Emma had never received any experimental cancer treatment. In fact, her cancer had been successfully treated with standard chemotherapy covered by her insurance over a year before I signed over my inheritance. The family had used her genuine health scare as cover for the most elaborate financial scam I'd ever heard of. They'd stolen nearly $3 million from me by exploiting my love for Emma and my fear of losing another family member. As I sat in that lawyer's office, staring at the evidence of their betrayal, I realized I wasn't just dealing with greedy relatives. I was dealing with master manipulators who'd been planning this con from the moment Grandma Rose's will was read. The moment I decided to fight back wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet and cold, sitting in my car outside that lawyer's office with tears streaming down my face. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and spent the entire day researching elder abuse laws, inheritance fraud, and fiduciary duty violations. What I discovered gave me the first spark of hope I'd felt in months. The family trust they'd convinced me to establish had specific legal requirements about how the money could be used, and buying lake houses and luxury cars for personal use was absolutely not permitted. They hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, they'd committed multiple felonies. My first step was confronting Emma directly. I showed up at her house on a Saturday morning when I knew Robert wouldn't be there, armed with copies of the medical records my investigator had obtained. When she opened the door, she looked genuinely surprised to see me, but not the kind of surprise you'd expect from someone who'd been supposedly too sick for visitors for 2 years. She was wearing workout clothes and had a healthy tan that definitely didn't come from lying in a hospital bed receiving experimental cancer treatment. The conversation was brutal. At first, she tried to maintain the lie, insisting she was still undergoing treatment and that the records must be wrong. But when I laid out the evidence, the property purchases, the timeline of her actual treatment, the financial records, she completely broke down. Emma's confession was even worse than I'd imagined. She admitted that her cancer had been successfully treated within 6 months of her diagnosis, covered entirely by insurance. The family had seen my inheritance as an opportunity to solve all their financial problems, and they'd used her legitimate health scare as the perfect cover story. Robert had orchestrated the entire scheme, convincing Emma that I was too naive and irresponsible to handle that much money anyway, and that the family deserved a share of Grandma Rose's wealth since they'd been helping take care of her for years. Emma had gone along with it because Robert promised to pay off her mortgage and set up college funds for her kids. She was crying so hard she could barely speak, begging me to understand that she never meant for it to go this far. But what really infuriated me was learning how they'd continued the deception. The family had been actively coordinating their lies, making sure their stories matched whenever I asked questions. They'd even gone so far as to have Emma avoid social media or carefully curate her posts to maintain the illusion that she was still sick. Robert had been monitoring my social media and phone calls, making sure I didn't get suspicious or try to contact Emma directly. They'd turned my genuine concern for my cousin's health into a weapon against me, manipulating my emotions with surgical precision for over 2 years. The turning point came when Emma revealed something that changed everything. She told me that Robert had been bragging to other family members about how easy it was to manipulate me, calling me the gullible little orphan, and joking about how Grandma Rose had wasted her money on someone too stupid to manage it. He'd even told Emma that if I ever got suspicious, they could always claim the money had been lost in bad investments or medical expenses that weren't covered. The cruelty of it took my breath away. This wasn't just about money. They'd been mocking me, laughing at my grief and my trust, turning my love for my family into a joke they shared behind my back. That's when I realized I wasn't just going to get my money back. I was going to make sure they faced consequences for every single lie they'd told and every dollar they'd stolen. I contacted the district attorney's office and filed a formal complaint for inheritance fraud, conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty. I also reached out to the IRS since none of their property purchases had been properly reported as income. But the move that really got their attention was when I filed a civil lawsuit seeking not just the return of my inheritance, but triple damages for fraud and punitive damages for emotional distress. The legal papers were served to Robert, Sarah, and Linda simultaneously on a Monday morning, and within 2 hours, my phone was ringing off the hook with panicked family members demanding to know what I thought I was doing. For the first time in 3 years, I had all the power in our relationship, and I was finally ready to use it. The family's reaction to the lawsuit was everything I'd expected and worse. Within hours of being served, Robert showed up at my apartment building, pounding on my door and screaming about how I was destroying the family over money. When I wouldn't let him in, he started calling me every name in the book through the door, telling my neighbors that I was an ungrateful brat who was trying to ruin a cancer patient's life. But his anger quickly turned to desperation when he realized I had copies of every financial record, every property deed, and every piece of evidence that proved their 3-year con. The man who'd always intimidated me with his loud voice and commanding presence was suddenly begging me to work this out as a family and asking what it would take to make this misunderstanding go away. The confrontation I'll never forget happened at the emergency family meeting Robert called 2 weeks later. He'd convinced my Aunt Linda and cousin Sarah that they could talk me out of the lawsuit if they all apologized and offered to pay back some of the money. They met me at a restaurant, thinking a public setting would keep things civilized, but they'd seriously underestimated how angry I'd become. Robert started with his usual manipulation tactics, talking about how Grandma Rose wouldn't have wanted the family torn apart by legal battles, and how we needed to think about Emma's children who would suffer if their father went to prison. But when Sarah had the audacity to suggest that I was being vindictive and selfish for not considering the family's perspective, I finally exploded. I stood up in that restaurant and told them exactly what I thought of their perspective. I explained in excruciating detail how they'd exploited my grief, manipulated my love for Emma, and stolen nearly $3 million while making me feel guilty for even asking questions about my own inheritance. I told them about the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, worried about Emma's health, while they were laughing about my gullibility. I shared how I'd been living paycheck to paycheck, denying myself basic necessities, because I thought my money was saving my cousin's life. By the time I finished, half the restaurant was staring at our table, and my so-called family looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. My lawyer had built an airtight case, and the evidence was so overwhelming that Robert's attorney advised him to settle before it went to trial. The financial forensics revealed that they'd stolen $2.8 million and spent it on luxury purchases, investment properties, and personal expenses that had nothing to do with medical treatment. Under federal fraud statutes, I was entitled to triple damages, which meant they owed me $8.4 million plus legal fees and punitive damages. The final settlement amount was $9.2 million, money that would have to come from selling every property they'd purchased with my inheritance, plus liquidating Robert's business and other assets. But the money wasn't even the most satisfying part of my victory. Robert was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for inheritance fraud and conspiracy. Sarah lost her banking license and faced her own criminal charges for her role in setting up the fraudulent trust. Linda was forced to sell her house to pay restitution and received 3 years of probation. Emma, because she cooperated with the investigation and testified against Robert, received a suspended sentence, but had to perform community service and pay a substantial fine. The local newspaper covered the story extensively, and suddenly everyone in town knew exactly what kind of people my family really were. The most powerful moment came 6 months later, when I was finally able to visit Grandma Rose's grave with a clear conscience. I'd used part of the settlement money to restore her headstone and plant the rose garden she'd always talked about wanting. As I sat there among the flowers, I realized that she would have been proud of me for fighting back, for refusing to let her memory be tainted by their greed and manipulation. I'd learned the hardest lesson of my adult life, that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who genuinely care about your well-being and treat you with respect. The people who'd raised me after my parents died, who'd used my love against me, who'd mocked my trust behind my back, were never really my family at all. Today, I'm 31 years old, financially secure for the first time in my life, and I've learned to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. I've used part of the settlement to establish a scholarship fund in Grandma Rose's name for students who've aged out of foster care, and I've started volunteering with organizations that help people recover from financial fraud. If there's anyone listening to this story who's being pressured by family members to make financial decisions that make you uncomfortable, please trust that little voice in your head that's telling you something is wrong. Real family doesn't manipulate your emotions to steal from you, and real love doesn't come with conditions or demands for money. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries, even when it means standing up to the people who raised you. I learned that lesson the hard way, but I'm stronger for it, and I'll never let anyone take advantage of my kindness again.